Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews. Welcome to today's webinar, The State of K-8 Social Studies. We are so glad that you could join us. The webinar is part of a special fall series, Rising to the Challenge, High Quality Instruction in K-8 Social Studies, brought to you by inquirED and the National Council for the Social Studies. You can go to learn.inquirED.org/challenge to view the full series. Up next, we'll be joined by Larry Berger, CEO and co-founder of Amplify Education, and Shanti Ellen Govind, CEO and founder of inquirED, to discuss the power of high-quality instructional materials. And then we will dig into practice with John White, Chief Success Officer of Great Minds, and Sarah Milo Haskow, Head of Partner Experience at inquirED. As I mentioned, this webinar and the series is brought to you by two organizations. First, the National Council for the Social Studies. The National Council for the Social Studies was founded in 1921, and it is the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. It engages and supports educators in strengthening and advocating for the social studies. You should go to socialstudies.org and explore all of their professional learning opportunities and learn more about the upcoming 2023 National Conference that's going to be happening in Nashville, Tennessee in December. Find out about that. It's a great place to connect with social studies colleagues. The webinar is also brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum. We ask a lot of teachers. We believe it's time to ask more of our curriculum. We give teachers the tools for high-quality hands-on instruction, build deep social studies content knowledge, and develop literacy and critical thinking skills. Please go to inquirED.org to find out more. I'm going to stop my screen share right now because it's time to bring on Elisabeth Ventling Simon. She is the Chief Academic Officer and co-founder of inquirED.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you all for joining us. Before we introduce our panelists, I want to just echo the kind of framing idea for the webinar that Martin already mentioned. So often the default solution to any educational challenge right now in our landscape is to ask more of teachers, to teach more content, different methods, to spend more time, to create more resources, and to serve more students. And as our panelists today share findings about the missing infrastructure for K-5 social studies, I want to invite us to shift our thinking and consider how we can ask more of our curriculum providers, our school leaders, and policymakers so that teachers have the support that they need. Let's keep that in mind as we're joined today by Julia H. Kaufman, Associate Research Department Director, Co-Director of American Educator Panels, and Senior Policy Researcher at RAND, and Melissa K. Diliberti, Assistant Policy Researcher at RAND. They are authors, along with Ashley Wu, of a recent RAND Corporation report, The Missing Infrastructure for Elementary K-5 Social Studies Instruction, Findings from the 2022 American Instructional Resources Survey. Julia and Melissa, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Before we dig into this report, I'd love to have you share with me a little bit about what inspired you to focus on the elementary years of social studies instruction in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. It's so great to be here with so many of you that are working on social studies issues across the United States. The reason we focused on elementary social studies in this report was there were multiple reasons. One was just that originally we weren't even funded to focus on social studies, which I think speaks to the fact that there's not a lot of funding to really dig into this issue. But we had an opportunity through a group of funders that were interested in this issue, but had originally funded us just to focus on the use of high quality materials across classrooms in the United States, mainly in math, English language arts, and science. But we had this opportunity with one of the surveys to also open it up to social studies teachers only at the elementary level. We only had enough sample and enough of an ability to open it up to elementary teachers. But Melissa and I have been studying social studies issues for a while, and we were starting to think that we really needed to have better national data on this issue than we had. and our funders were supportive, and so we did it. It isn't just that elementary is the most important. Of course, it's important across grade levels, but it is really interesting to look specifically at the elementary level because, you know, that's where we're building a foundation for kids. And I think it tells us something. But our work that we're going to present today, we're also going to look broadly at the policy landscape across K-12. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit more about the motivation for this report. So as I mentioned, schools have been mostly focused on math and reading. Our work to this point had been focused on math and reading and science. However, a lot of data tells us that in social studies, we have reason to be concerned. We don't have a lot of data from social studies, but we do have National Assessment of Education Progress scores. These are the most recent scores we have in grades 4, 8, and 12. And you can see that proficiency is low across these social studies subject areas. It's been low. It actually dipped a little in 2022, while everything else dipped as well because of the pandemic. But when we look at schools themselves and how they're addressing changes post-pandemic, we know that they're focused a lot on math and reading. So I'm not sure that we have reason to think that these scores are going to go up a lot unless we focus more on them. We all have done some RAND reporting highlighting civic education as a poorly measured, weak aspect of civic infrastructure. So we have some documentation of state standards and accountability policies related to social studies. And then we also have some information from NAEP about social studies content knowledge. But we really don't have a way of monitoring student performance on a state-by-state basis regularly. So we get this big national report and know what that looks like. But we have no idea state-by-state, even though there's a lot of variability in state policies and a lot of reason to believe that social studies knowledge varies state-by-state as well. So just want to highlight some of our methods here. First, the things I'm going to present to you first before turning it over to Melissa, focus on the literature on state policies. We also conducted national representative surveys in 21-22 that I mentioned. So we have a sample size of about 745 K-5 public school teachers, and 92% of those across subjects, 61% lower elementary, 39% upper elementary. We also surveyed K-12 public school principals. So we do have a little bit of K-12 social studies data that we'll share as well. So here is our conceptual framework that we use to guide the study that we did. We focus on the state level context as a place where the infrastructure for social studies starts. States can provide, of course, they do provide state standards, but they can also provide recommendations for instructional materials. The political environment can also vary, of course, state by state. They can also set up strong accountability and assessment policies. So I'm going to talk about that first. And then Melissa's going to talk a little about the district and the classroom context. And we'll gather mostly that district and classroom context stuff through the survey data that we share. So let me talk a little bit about the state level infrastructure. So one recent report we have is a review the Thomas B. Fordham Institute did of the state of standards for civics and U.S. history. Now, there is not broad agreement about what state standards for civics and history should focus on necessarily. There are a lot of different ideas about what should be the focus. But the point here is that when they looked across standards and looked at the presence of various standards compared to others, what they saw was that they varied a lot across states. And that's a really important takeaway to keep in mind, because it really implies that when teachers and schools think about what to adopt as far as instructional materials, what to teach, they look at state standards as a way to guide that. And so when the Fordham Institute conducted their review, they focused on things like content, rigor, completeness of standards, organization, clarity, and they only rated 5 states as having exemplary standards in both history and civics. And at the other end of the spectrum, they rated 20 states as having inadequate standards. And by inadequate, they mean things like not having guidance that was clear, or having guidance that was overly broad, or having standards that were disorganized, or missing things like argumentation or discussion of current events. So that's one piece of the puzzle, is that there's a lot of variation in state standards. And we know that from other reviews of state standards beyond just the Fordham review. In addition, only 3 states actually monitor social studies performance and collect data on social studies performance. In contrast, of course, every state gathers data on math and reading performance. And even those that administer an assessment, even when these assessments are in place, they are not offered regularly for the most part. They're only offered once every few years or for subpopulations of students. And another piece of this puzzle in terms of policy are the states that have recently passed restrictions on discussing racism and sexuality in the classroom, so race and gender limitations. In this kind of environment, the politicization of social studies comes into play all the time when teachers are trying to make decisions about what to teach. So not only do they have variable standards guidance, but they also get a lot of mixed messages about what to teach in the classroom and how to teach it. Now I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, whose bandwidth is hopefully better than mine, and she's going to share a little bit of data.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And hopefully my audio is going well too. So as Julia described, at the state level, we see this large variability in the quality of states' academic standards. We see less emphasis on monitoring and accountability for social studies achievement than we see in other core subjects. And we see this variability in the state political context that might shape messaging around social studies contents. There's a lot of differences happening at the state level. So I'm going to now turn to what's going on at the local level, focusing on local level infrastructure or the supports that are provided at the school or district level that are specifically targeted at social studies instruction. And these are going to be things like teacher evaluation, professional development, and guidance around curriculum. And in this section, I'm going to use data from our nationally representative principal survey, which this survey was administered to K-12 principals. I'm mostly going to focus on patterns that we see at the elementary level, but in a couple places, I'll bring in some findings at the secondary level just for a comparison point. So thanks, Julia, for flipping slides. We're first going to look at teacher evaluation, which we use as a proxy for teachers receiving constructive feedback from their school administrators on their instructional practices. And what we found is that virtually all elementary principals we surveyed reported evaluating teachers' instructional practice in ELA and math in 2021-2022. But in contrast, only 2/3 of elementary principals evaluated teachers in social studies. So this is a pretty significant drop in social studies relative to ELA and math. And furthermore, we note that there are very large differences by school demographics, such as by school poverty status. So for example, principals in high poverty elementary schools were particularly unlikely to conduct teacher evaluations focused on social studies instruction. And we observed the same pattern in schools that served high shares of minority students, in schools serving high shares of historically low achieving students. And our hypothesis from this analysis is really that potentially historically advantaged schools are the only ones that have the luxury to concentrate on potentially improving social studies instruction, because other schools might be more focused on we're more concerned about reaching their proficiency targets in ELA and math, meaning that they don't have the time to focus on improving social studies education. And we observed the same pattern of under-provision of supports for social studies relative to ELA and math when we look at other things too, such as professional learning opportunities. So this slide is showing professional learning opportunities. We have professional development, coaching, and collaborative learning with other teachers. And as you can see from the green bars, we're really seeing under provision for social studies relative to ELA and math in particular. So for example, about 95% of elementary principals reported providing workshops or trainings focused on ELA instruction at least once during the 2021-2022 school year. But in comparison, only half, or about 52% of principals said their school or district provided workshops or trainings focused on social studies. Similarly, 86% of elementary school principals were in schools that provided coaching focused on ELA, but only 40% said that their schools provided coaching on social studies. So we're seeing just significant under provision of PD relative to other subjects. So the slide that I just focused on was about elementary professional learning supports for at the elementary level, but what happens when we look at the secondary level? So thanks, Julia. So what's going on at the secondary level? So in 2021-2022, teacher evaluations and all 3 types of professional learning activities were more common at the secondary level than at the elementary level for social studies. So for example, 80% of secondary school principals said their school provided PD to social studies teachers, compared with only 52% who said so at the elementary level. And we hypothesized that this greater prevalence of supports at the secondary level for social studies might be related to the fact that social studies become subject-specific instruction as you move from the elementary to the secondary grades. But we still see that even though supports are more prevalent at the secondary level than at the elementary for social studies, we still see that they're less prevalent for social studies at the secondary level than they are for ELA and math. So for example, about 78% of secondary principals reported evaluating teachers in social studies at the secondary level, more than the 67% who said so that they did so at the elementary level, but this was still less than the 89% of secondary principals who evaluated teachers in ELA and math. And not only did elementary schools provide less teacher evaluation and less professional learning opportunities for social studies than for ELA and math, they also provided less guidance around materials. So to answer questions about guidance around materials, what we did is we gave principals lists of social studies materials and asked them to indicate which of these were provided by their school or district as a requirement or recommendation for teachers to use in 2021-2022. And in places where teachers are required or recommended to use specific curriculum materials, we refer to this as schools having adopted the curriculum material. So by adopted, we just mean that this is required or recommended for teachers to use. And what we found is that roughly a third of elementary schools, their principal said that their school or district hadn't adopted any curriculum materials that they provide to teachers as a requirement or a recommendation to support social studies. In comparison, only 2% of principals said that their schools didn't adopt or provide any guidance around ELA or math curriculum. So this is a pretty big difference, from about 30% to about 2%. And the slide is showing differences for elementary principals, but we see the same pattern for secondary principals as well. And if you go to the next slide, Julia, just to dive a little bit deeper into what specific curriculum materials schools had adopted, on this slide, we're listing the most common curriculum materials that principals said were required or recommended by their school or district to support social studies instruction. And at both the elementary and secondary levels, principals reported that their schools or districts most often required or recommended that their teachers use locally created, by this we mean like materials created by their school or district, or self-created materials, as opposed to published curriculum materials to support social studies instruction. So for example, 25% of secondary principals and 19% of elementary principals said that their schools require or recommend that teachers use self-created materials for social studies. When we look at the adoption of published curriculum materials at the elementary level, the curriculum most often required or recommended was Studies Weekly, which was adopted by only 19% of elementary schools. And at the secondary level, the principals most often identified history textbooks by like McGraw-Hill and HMH as the materials that they require or recommend. And if you want to learn more, we have a lot of data on like particular adoption of curriculum materials, of like what schools are requiring or recommending and what teachers are using. And we can put a link to a report in the chat if you're interested in like learning more about specific curriculum materials. But I think just the key takeaway here is that principals are reporting that schools are providing less guidance around curriculum materials for social studies than they are for ELA and math. And when schools do provide recommendations, they're providing a diverse set of materials as a recommendation, including many who recommend using locally created or self-created materials. So we also asked elementary principals to what extent shared teaching practices were present at their school to support teachers' instruction. And shared teaching practices, along with other things like defined goals for student learning, a shared purpose, and processes to support collaboration, these are things that are all hypothesized to be important conditions for enabling instructional system coherence and avoiding fragmentation or inconsistency in student learning. And what we find is that when we ask principals about whether shared teaching practices were present, we found that they were present to a lesser extent for social studies in 2021-2022 than for ELA, math, and science. So only 9% of elementary principals indicated that shared teaching practices were present to a large extent for social studies, compared with 36% who said that these shared practices were present to a large extent for ELA, and 37% said so for math. And so, although again, not presented on the slide is for elementary school, but we see this exact same pattern at the secondary level as well. And then to conclude our findings here, looking at principals, what we did is we sorted elementary principals into low, medium, and high support schools based on whether or not they evaluate teachers in social studies, how often they provide social studies focused professional learning activities, whether they were giving guidance around curriculum materials and what types of materials they were recommending. And basically high support elementary schools are the ones that do the most to support social studies, and low support schools do the least to support social studies. And what we did is we then looked at the relationship relationship between these supports and the presence of shared teaching practices, which is our proxy for understanding like instructional system coherence. And we found that shared social studies teaching practices were more prevalent to a greater extent in schools that provided more supportive environments. Nearly all elementary principals, or about 92%, in high support schools reported shared teaching practices were present to some extent, including 2/3 who said these were present to a moderate or large extent. And in contrast, many fewer principals in low support schools said that these shared practices were present to a moderate or large extent. And again, we see the exact same pattern at the secondary level, although we see the difference is starker at the elementary level than at the secondary level. But our takeaway from this preliminary analysis is really that, at least according to principals' perceptions, providing more comprehensive supports might be an effective mechanism to try to create more formalized and more coherent instructional practices in this subject. Okay, so as we saw, state policies supporting social studies instruction can be scattered, and district and school level supports targeted specifically at social studies are provided at much lower levels than for other subjects. So what do we see that's actually happening like in the classrooms? What do general elementary teachers tell us is actually happening in their classrooms? So in this section, we're going to use data from our nationally representative teacher survey to examine how general elementary teachers are approaching social studies instruction and how their approaches to the subject might be different than in other core academic subject areas. And just as a reminder, here we only have data from elementary teachers. So in this section, we're focused exclusively at the elementary level. First, and likely related to the lack of guidance that teachers are receiving from their school systems, elementary teachers largely perceive themselves to be the main decision maker around what curriculum materials to use in their classroom. Roughly 60% of elementary teachers said that they themselves or their peers made decisions around what materials to use in their classroom. In contrast, for other subjects like ELA, math, and science, district and teachers really perceive district and school leaders to be the key decision makers around materials in these other subjects. So social studies is definitely a little bit different here, where there seems to be more teacher autonomy or teacher control over what curriculum is being taught in the classroom. So if elementary teachers are deciding on their own what materials to use, it begs the question, what are they using? And so like principals, we asked teachers a long series of survey items about their use of various curriculum, including what materials they used, whether these materials were required or recommended, and how often they used them. And we took teachers' responses to these series of survey items, and we used their responses to group them into 4 very broad bins. And our bins are, first of all, textbook teachers. These are teachers who mostly use a required published curriculum for the majority of their instructional time. Then we have do-it-yourself teachers who use self-created materials for most of their instructional time. We have what we call local material teachers, which is maybe not the best title for this category, but these are teachers who are using materials that were developed locally by their school or their district. And then we have these cobbler teachers who don't fall into any of the previous categories and who don't predominantly use any one type of material. So these are teachers who are just using a bunch of different things to try to fill out their instructional time. And when we tried to figure out what proportion of teachers fell into these buckets, we found that about half of elementary teachers, or 52%, were cobblers using some combination of textbooks, locally created materials, and their own materials, but they didn't use any one of these materials for the bulk of their instructional time. Meanwhile, only 16% of elementary teachers were textbook teachers. These were teachers who relied on a district required or recommended published curriculum for most of their instructional time. And 22% were do-it-yourself teachers who used self-created materials for the bulk of their instructional time. And, this is kind of hard to parse out because there are good reasons why you might want to cobble in, multiple materials as part of your instruction. You might be trying to make up for missing content that's in your textbook, or trying to bring in more diverse perspectives. But at the same time, over-reliance on a bunch of different materials creates concern about there being inequities across classrooms and what students are actually being exposed to in the classroom. And I just also want to say, teachers did report using a wide variety of supplemental materials. So these are things that we don't define as curriculum materials, but additional supplemental materials, things from Teachers Pay Teachers, Brain Pop, YouTube, Scholastic News, Kahoot. Those are all very popular. And again, I'll put a link in the chat so you can see kind of the percentages and all these types of different materials that teachers are using. But I think the key takeaway here is just a lot of teachers are using a lot of different things to cover their social studies instruction. Yeah, and so thanks, Julia. In addition to asking about curriculum use, we also asked general elementary teachers about how they spend their instructional time. And like other studies, we find that general elementary teachers spend fewer instructional hours per week focused on social studies. The teachers who took our survey reported spending 9 hours per week on ELA and about 7 hours per week on math. In contrast, general elementary teachers spend only 3 hours per week on social studies. And what's interesting is we also asked about instructional planning time, and we found that teachers spent 2 hours per week planning for their social studies instruction, compared with about 4 hours planning their ELA instruction. And when you combine these two things together, it means that teachers are spending more time planning per hour of social studies instruction than they are for other subjects. And we're hypothesizing that this relative inefficiency in planning time might be related to the lack of guidance that teachers are getting from their school system and this need to cobble together materials from many places to support this instruction, which is why they're having to spend more time planning for it, as compared to ELA or math, where instruction might be more controlled and more closely tied to a single curriculum. And to conclude here, before I turn it back over to Julia, we also looked at how teachers prioritized various goals when they planned for their instruction. We gave teachers 18 different priorities, ranging from things like student engagement to alignment with state standards and assessment, to provision of dedicated supports to help struggling learners. And we asked them to rank which of these 18 priorities were in their top 5. And then what we did is we compared their priorities in each subject. And so here we're just showing how teachers ranked various priorities for social studies, and then we're using ELA as a comparison point. And we found that for both social studies and ELA, teachers overwhelmingly prioritize student engagement and alignment with state standards when deciding what activities to do in their classroom. And I think this is just further underscoring Julia's point earlier about just how important state standards are. But after these top 2 priorities, student engagement and state standards, we see that priorities became more scattered across subjects and even within social studies teachers. So for ELA teachers, the third most common priority was provision of scaffolds or supports that help students master grade level content. This was not a priority for social studies instruction. And we don't really know why, but we suspect that teachers, social studies teachers may not be certain what scaffolding looks like, and therefore don't consider this a priority in their instruction. And I'll stop there and pass this back over to Julia to talk about implications and recommendations, and then we can open it up for questions.
I just wanted to close it out with a few implications, but you all spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms, so there might be even different implications than these for you. For us, we think a lot about the differences in what kids get in the classroom and the differences in how teachers are supported across the United States. And so for us, this inadequate infrastructure tells us that teachers are mostly on their own to make instruction decisions without adequate guidance, and in a challenging political environment where they're also not given a lot of guidance. And then there's this high variation in state requirements and standards, along with this high degree of teacher choice. And so it undoubtedly leads to some variability in social studies instruction from classroom to classroom. So kids are getting a lot of different things depending on their state, depending on their teacher. Sometimes it may be amazing social studies instruction, and sometimes it may just be a lot different from what the other child is getting. And school leaders, district leaders, and policymakers don't have a lot of means to discourage or monitor this variability. To Melissa's point about scaffolding, I'm not sure that teachers can scaffold when they don't know if kids aren't doing well, right? And so that might be one of the reasons that they don't. In terms of recommendations, here are some. Again, I think it would be really interesting to hear from you all about the thoughts that you have about what these data imply as far as recommendations go. But a start would be to have more consistent and coherent state standards. We do know that there are efforts like the C3 standards, as well as the various other efforts to ensure that states are more consistent in what they ask students to master academically. More robust accountability policies. If students were tested more regularly, we'd have more sense about how students are doing. Teachers would have more sense about how students are doing and be able to address what they're missing. Teachers need more supports, like evaluation, like professional learning, like good materials that can encourage them to address particular content, but can also just provide them with guidance so they're not guessing on what they should be bringing into the classroom and aren't spending so much time developing materials.
We have a really great resource when you're talking about ELA to find vetted high quality instructional materials. How do people determine whether something is high quality? That's a question in social studies, I think.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think there are rubrics that can help us with that. For example, inquirED actually has a rubric for evaluating curriculum materials that can be really useful. I mean, the first thing to think about, of course, is content and whether the content that is addressed in instructional materials is the content that's really closely aligned with your state standards. I mean, that can take time to do yourself. There are states that have done that for teachers, states like Louisiana, a few more states, not a lot of states at this point, but there are states that have done that. But there are also other questions like the cultural relevance of materials, the extent to which they're asking students to really inquire about challenges that face them and that face the world. So those are just some of the pieces of how to judge the quality of materials, but it can be an effort. I mean, before we've had good review of curriculum materials, districts essentially have been doing this on their own, and districts put together communities of teachers to figure that out. And it does take time, but I think it's well worth it if you're going to bring a material into your classroom to make sure that it's the best possible material it can be.
Yeah, I'll echo everything Julia just said. We kind of wrote about this in the report too, but this is really where we see a role for, districts and state policymakers, state departments of education, and also nonprofits to really do this work, but also be transparent about their findings and to disseminate what they're finding about high quality materials. And I think we don't want to redo the wheel where everyone has to do this themselves. And I feel like this information sharing is a really critical part of identifying these high quality materials for social studies.
I'm curious, as you are digging into your findings and thinking about the missing infrastructure and looking at that compared with proficiency in social studies, were there some things that really stood out to you that seemed to be the most critical elements of that infrastructure? Or maybe some trends that you noted when you're comparing to the infrastructure that's available in math or reading, for instance?
Yeah, I can start, and Julia, feel free to jump in. But I think just to clarify, we were not able to link our survey data with achievement data. That's one of our aspirations. So if anyone has ideas about how to help us do that, we are all ears, because I think we want to investigate this exact question about which of these supports have the strongest relationship with achievement. And if we're able to figure that out, right, it kind of creates incentive or interest in focusing on those particular supports. I think my hypothesis is that academic standards just have to be super critical in this, and that have to be central in this effort, and that the other supports would be supplementary. But I'll let Julia weigh in if she has a different or anything else to add to that hypothesis.
Well, I think standards are a really important foundation. I think they're a really important first step. And if we could have consistent standards across the United States, that would be an awesome first step. But then, we have decades of research telling us that standards themselves and improving them isn't necessarily going to change instruction. And so, the next step is to ensure that you have materials that are adopted in your district that really well align with standards. There is a group of states that are really focused on this for math and English language arts and science. It's called the High Quality Instructional Material and Professional Development Network. And they've actually had a lot of success at putting in place policies that have encouraged districts to adopt particular curriculum materials. It's been really exciting to watch the rise in what teachers say they're using, not only what districts and schools say they're adopting, but what teachers are using. And so I really do feel like states have a huge role to play here in terms of encouraging materials. Now, there was that great question in the chat about local control versus state control. In deep red states, Brian Keller said, we prefer to local control. What do y'all think would be the best route? And that is definitely true. I think in those cases, sometimes what we're seeing from our data is that even districts aren't providing the guidance. And in that case, I think it is incumbent upon districts to kind of step up and offer the guidance that teachers need. And it makes the state's role, I think, harder. I think it makes it in states sometimes, I mean, districts don't have the capacity to do that. So I meant it makes districts' role harder because districts sometimes have the capacity to do that. And so maybe district networks across states are a way to go, finding like-minded districts and working together to build that infrastructure, review materials together, identify what's realigned with your standards. Those are steps that districts could take as well.
There's a couple, there's a lot of discussion in the chat about the sort of marginalization of the social studies, which I think is something that is reflected in your study and felt deeply by our attendees. And specifically, I think Scott mentions that, there's so much time and energy spent in ELA. 2 to 3 hours a day sometimes are recommended. So literally there's no time for the social studies.
I can start us off. I just want to, so Julia and I wrote an op-ed, which we can also put in the chat, like kind of speculating about like why we wouldn't expect NAEP scores to change at all, like if we do nothing. And one of the hypotheses or things that we brought up, which I think is really interesting, is like this lack of a national sense of alarm about how kids are doing in this subject. Like you see a headline every 4 years, like when NAEP comes out. But, we've seen a lot of like op-ed pieces about like, COVID learning loss and, helping kids like in the struggle to help kids recover from the pandemic. And they're all focused on ELA and math. And you can see how parents could have a sense of like urgency or around that, like because they're getting these like score reports all the time from MAP or, from their state summative assessments. But if parents like don't have any idea like how their kids are doing in social studies, it's really hard to build up this like national like sense of alarm or like urgency around improving achievement in the subject. And so I feel like assessment and accountability needs to be part of the discussion about like how to make social studies like invest in it and how do we want to care about it. And like how we want to like prioritize it. And I think like if we don't have like data to show this like national sense of like alarm, I think it's really hard to like motivate, a sense of like urgency around it. And yes, to the comment in the chat, that's the obvious problem or like, response is like, we don't have any more time for like assessments and like they're burdensome and it's taking more time away for instruction. And I know we've been following this like model that's being proposed. I think it's in Louisiana where they're trying to like integrate social studies and their ELA assessments together. So you can essentially like double dip and get a sense of like how kids are performing in both subjects. And I think that like makes sense because like ELA and social studies have obvious overlap together. But I think we need to have some of these like innovative ideas about how to monitor assessment and achievement and learning in social studies without, creating additional burden, which is, an obvious non-starter. Julia, feel free to push back or weigh in with other thoughts.
No, 100% that our accountability system also puts pressure on teachers to focus on math and reading. So it's not only not creating a sense of urgency for parents when you have really robust accountability systems, but also creating these pressures on teachers to divert attention. So it's not as if they're spending more time on ELA and math and social studies because they think that those things are so important naturally, but they're being told these things are more important. And so they are at this point probably thinking they're important because of all the messages and pressures they get to focus on them.
There was a question about making it, and I think a lot of people out there, if they think that social studies is important, then they'll say, well, of course, juniors in high school should take civics classes because, they're so close to being able to vote and to participate in that way. And I think someone Christina from Florida in the chat said, how do we get people to focus specifically on elementary as a value?
I hate to be beating the same drum to death, but I do feel like materials are important. And if you have a textbook for social studies along with a textbook for ELA and a textbook for math, sending that message to teachers. And, that question about whether focusing on social studies as part of ELA, that's good. I think that's really important, and it helps us because, if teachers are spending 9 hours of instructional time per week on ELA, bringing social studies into that is great. But there are things to learn in social studies apart from just, what you learn through an ELA class that are really key, pieces of how our government works, that are so important to learn when you're in elementary school, when you're putting that foundation together to be a US citizen. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here, so, I recognize that. But I think, the first step, again, is consistent standards. The second step is high quality instructional materials. And the third step is ensuring that you're giving teachers those messages through professional learning, through evaluation, through all these pieces of infrastructure that it is important to.
I really appreciate you kind of highlighting these different aspects of infrastructure that are so interconnected. If we don't have robust assessment, we're not able to measure that students aren't doing well or don't know these things. If we don't have standards, we don't even know what to measure. So if standards are inadequate or incomplete, how are we even making these judgments? And I think the instructional timepiece that you bring up, Martin, is so important. It doesn't matter how clear the standards are or how high stakes the assessments are if teachers don't have instructional time in their day to actually provide that instruction. I agree with you completely, Julia, that there are things that students can learn related to social studies through ELA as they're grappling with content as readers and writers. But often, in my experience, what I see are that students are maybe reading about a historical topic, but they're developing knowledge, perhaps, which is kind of the bottom of the rigor pyramid if we're thinking about how they are analyzing relationships, drawing conclusions, doing evaluative work. They're not necessarily thinking like a historian or an economist or a geographer, or they're not doing that civic thinking or engaging in creative problem solving. They are maybe knowing facts. And so it really is a different beast, I think. And I'm curious if that's something that has come up in your findings as well.
Yeah, we're not able to get at this idea like specifically, although I totally agree with like everything that you said. And I think there's a lot of discussion going on in the chat about like, how do you put a boundary around social studies? How do you measure like learning in this area? Like it's so abstract. I like this comment that social studies is an experience, not a skill. And I think that makes it really hard to treat social studies as like analogous to the other core disciplines because it is kind of like a different beast. And so I think we have to think about how to treat it equally with the other subjects, but, recognize that it's different in some way, perhaps in a way that, requires a different set of supports.
Yeah. And it's not just, accountability tests. They typically have to be, there's this push to ensure that they're very strong psychometrically. And there are lots of reasons why it's hard for a social studies assessment for accountability purposes to really capture all the things that we think are really important to learn in social studies. But on the other hand, there are a lot of leaps and bounds in the way that we assess in classrooms through benchmark assessments, through interim assessments, and that's some of the work that Louisiana was doing as well. And so I think, getting comfortable with non-traditional ways of assessing through performance tasks and assessments, and thinking about how to scale that across school systems is a really exciting idea, and could help us think about how students are doing in social studies.
I want to pull out something that I think Maria in the chat said. We're referring to like a text, but and she said, do you really think traditional textbooks are the way to go? I don't think that anyone's saying that just a textbook in a first grade class is a high quality instructional material. There needs to be so much more that moves beyond that single textbook to allow the teacher who may be unfamiliar with social studies, like a few paragraphs in a textbook that gives them some advice about how to implement a lesson. That's better than nothing, but it's still not moving them to like a really high quality instruction. So I think I just wanted to bring that out of the chat and get your response to that. I think.
And thank you, Maria, for calling that out. I kept referring to textbooks, and I feel like I was just like instinctually pulling on like my thoughts about like what I learned when I was in elementary school. But you're completely right. Right now, when I'm talking about textbooks, I really should be saying curriculum materials. And by curriculum materials, what do I mean? Well, there are certainly school systems, every kid doesn't have a computer all the time. And so certainly you're talking about sometimes books, sometimes articles, sometimes things that they're holding in their hands. But of course, you're also talking about, you think about math and what's being used for math classrooms right now. There are texts, there are handouts, but there are also lots of ways that students go home and look up things and try things through supplemental materials. When we ask teachers what supplemental materials they use for social studies, that's where you get like so many different kinds of responses. Teachers are using so many cool things right now for social studies, so many interesting things, but so many variable things. And it's so hard to know which of those things are high quality, and they don't get guidance on them. I think places like iCivics do a really good job of pointing to great instructional materials that are really well aligned. So is the roadmap. I'm sorry, for some reason I'm like, it's escaping me. The roadmap to a democracy, the democracy roadmap. Thank you. That also links to lots of materials that link to the challenges that they identify. So there are places to go, but there's not like a guide that districts necessarily adopt as a curriculum or a set of curriculum materials. And so everyone's cobbling things together. That's where you get the cobbling kind of finding that we had, is that people are just pulling things from all different places. And sometimes they're probably doing that really well, but sometimes probably not so well.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Teachers don't have time for it. They don't have time to cobble together materials from iCivics and Educating for American Democracy and all these different places. There are a lot of great supplemental materials out there, but teachers have 30 minutes of planning time a day to plan for 6 subject areas. It's not realistic.
Yeah, I was just going to pick back up on the teacher. I agree with everything you said. I was going to pick back up on the teacher training and the teacher prep piece. And I wanted to say this also came up for principals when we first presented the teacher evaluation findings about like how teachers evaluate way less in social studies. And only 1/6 of the principals in our sample had previously been social studies teachers. So there were these questions about like, principals, most aren't familiar with the subject area. Do they actually know what good instruction looks like in the subject area? Do they feel comfortable like evaluating teachers or providing actual feedback about how their teachers are doing? And I think if we, like, principals also might not have like the necessary training and prep, like if their background isn't from social studies. And if we think instruction for social studies is like maybe different than evaluating like, high quality instruction in ELA or math.
Yeah.
Later on, in a later webinar, we're going to have John White from Great Minds and Sarah Milo Hoskow from inquirED, head of our partner experience. And they're going to talk about, if you have high quality instructional materials, how do you actually get them implemented across a district? Because that is a little bit what you're talking about, Melissa. Building principles are really, really important in that. If you have instructional coaches, they're really important. I know we have some on this call, but you really have to have that support for the classroom teacher at really every level, right? The building principal, the district, and they can really allow that teacher the space, the training, the time to implement.
Yeah, and I will say we didn't look at this systematically in our report, but in a couple places I ran like some quick tabulations, and it did seem like principals that had a background in social studies were the same ones that were more likely to evaluate, were the same ones to be in schools that provided more professional learning. I don't think I looked at guidance around materials, but that suggested to me that like if principals are familiar with the subject area, probably because they taught it before, they might have like greater buy-in into the subject area, and they might be more willing to push infrastructure supports to support the subject area. So I think the principal background and like what you were just saying, Martin, this idea of like a holistic look at the supports, I think is really critical.
I saw in the chat a question about teacher training, whether it's pre-service training or whether it's ongoing professional learning. And I think that's something that we've noticed in our work, that assessment in social studies traditionally is a correct answer that you can answer with a multiple choice question, right? And that's not social. So we can memorize state capitals and we can identify things on a map, but grappling with evidence or drawing evidence-based conclusions or forming an argument, these sort of skill-based things are much harder to assess. And it's something that teachers are it's new perhaps for them in instruction, and it's also very new for them in assessment. And so if assessment guidance isn't provided, it can be a real learning curve, is something that we found in our work, certainly.
That really connects to what just came up in the chat. Like, I think the idea that it's not about the right answer, but about the process that's being applied, that is one of the reasons why I think people feel like they can push back so much about in social studies, but they can't push back in ELA and other subjects, parents or communities, because they believe it's about the right answer that you're giving students, the indoctrination that you're giving students, instead about the inquiry process and asking questions and things like that. We are out of time. I'm going to give an award for the most amazing chat ever in a webinar. So you out there who have been chatting this whole time, thank you so much. And I think that speaks, Julia and Melissa, to the work that you're doing and how much it connects to what people are experiencing in the field out there as principals, curriculum directors, and teachers. So I just want to say thank you so much, Melissa and Julia and Elisabeth, for joining us today.